In recent decades, there has been a push for the preservation of historic sites and historic buildings. According to Barry Collingsworth in the article Historic Preservation in the USA, much of the push for historic preservation has actually come from the destruction of historic locations through redevelopment. When looking at historic preservation from the national level, sometimes the historic sites that seem worthy of preservation are obvious. Take a look at the National Register of Historic Places, and you'll see a number of battle sites, churches, homes, and more that played a role in our nation's history. For many of these, the reason for the preservation seems obvious. When looking at historic preservation from a local history standpoint, however, the sites that are worthy of historic preservation are oftentimes harder to determine. Behind me, you can probably see a fence blocking an empty lot. The address for this lot is 1201 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Street North in St. Petersburg, Florida. Just over 2 years ago, this lot contained an ice cream stand called Dairy Inn. It had been located here as a piece of St. Petersburg history since 1947. Today, the lot sits empty as it waits to become luxury townhomes. Was this local ice cream shop that served the town for over 76 years a site worthy of historic preservation? Personally, I tend to think so, but I recognize that I am biased since my grandfather ate here, my father ate here, and I ate here. However, the sudden demolition of Darien seemed to spark outrage in St. Petersburg. Although the ice cream shop was once beloved, now that it is gone, it's no longer a question as of if Darien should be preserved, but rather should Darien have been preserved.
Throughout the rest of the video, you will be seeing a variety of images pop up of Darien throughout specific periods of time, but I wanted to specifically point out two photos of Darien. The first was taken in the 1960s, when my father was a child. Darien, in its heyday, sitting in the same lot which I stood in front of. The second photo was of Darien probably about 10 to 12 years ago. This photo is how Darien used to look when I used to go to it, and it is still in the same lot that I stood in front of. I wanted to point this out because it's kind of hard to tell in the video that this is the same lot and what exactly this lot looks like, but I thought that since this lot meant so much to so many people, I should specifically kind of point out these images so you know what to imagine. And trust me, I know it's not the most impressive piece of architecture.
Julia Roque discusses these ideas in her article entitled 6 Practical Reasons to Save Old Buildings. Julia argues that preserving old buildings can actually be beneficial for a community's culture and its economy. She believes that old buildings have intrinsic value, and when you tear down an old building, you don't really know what's being destroyed. Within that building, there could be designs and details that are valuable for the community to protect. Julia also emphasizes how new businesses often like taking over old buildings, and how old buildings can attract people because of their look. Many of these old buildings and their looks have become part of the city's culture, so tearing them down can destroy aspects of the city's heritage. Julia's point with this article was that once a historic building is gone, there's no chance to renovate it or save it as a historic site. So the destruction of historic buildings should be considered with excessive care. After 7 sweet decades, a piece of St. Pete history has quietly closed its doors, was what one of the articles said when it was announced that Darien had closed. At first, nobody even knew why exactly Darien had shut down. The closure was very abrupt. However, just weeks later, in February 2024, the Tampa Bay Times reported that the Darien site was going to be razed and replaced with luxury townhomes priced between $1.2 million and $1.6 million. Darien may not have been a nationally significant landmark, but its long history, local meaning, and role in St. Pete's public memory made it a strong candidate for preservation. Darien mattered because it was old, local, and woven into everyday community life. Residents said that Darien is a piece of Pinellas history. Originally opened in April of 1947, multiple generations of St. Pete, Tampa Bay area residents have sampled the soft serve ice cream and homemade root beer and tasty burgers. Over that time, it has connected generations of residents to the same place, the same food, and the same neighborhood routines. Its demolition revealed that local historical significance is often found not only in monumental buildings, but also in everyday places that preserve community memory. Darien was not a grand civic monument or a battlefield or a mansion connected to some famous statesman. It was something much more ordinary, but also much more personal to local residents. Families went there after school, after Little League games, during summer evenings, or just because it was familiar. My dad and I would go there during his workday. It often served as classic American roadside food, and it had soft serve ice cream, burgers, hot dogs, and homemade root beer at the height of its time. Over time, however, Darien became part of the lived experience of St. Petersburg. That kind of history can be easy to overlook because it's not dramatic, but public history reminds us that ordinary places can also preserve extraordinary meaning. Darien remains a prime example of the struggles of historic preservation. One of the most difficult questions in preservation is deciding what deserves to be saved. There are many places that are easy to identify. They're often tied with major events, famous people, or they have some sort of distinctive architecture that makes them interesting or memorable. St. Petersburg has a number of these historic places itself, from hotels like the Vinoy to the historic St. Petersburg High School building and the C. Perry Snell House. At times, however, as in Darien's case, preservation fails. Although these sites have become lost to time, the work of public history can uncover and preserve the memory. Photographs, oral histories, local news coverage, and historical interpretation can still preserve the meaning of a place and promote conversation about the area's culture and their past, even after the building is actually gone. This does not mitigate the loss of the building, but it can help prevent the story from fading away. Not everyone would agree, however, that Darien should have been preserved. There are arguments that cities change. Private property owners have the right to make choices about their land, and not every old building needs to be saved. There are people who may point out that Darien was not a formally protected landmark and may not have met the stricter standards often used for preservation decisions. These are fair points. Historic preservation necessitates choices, and it is not possible for every old site to survive. Darien's case was significant because the conversation over preservation never happened. When significance to history is measured only in formal or economic terms, conversations and debates over historic preservation of culturally significant sites, like debatably Darien, never happen. When these discussions fail to occur, possible historic sites pay the price. The story of Darien is a conversation about reframing the focus of public history. It is also about recognizing the value of ordinary places that hold extraordinary meaning within a community. Ultimately, preserving Darien would not have been about preserving the largest or oldest or most beautiful or most famous place. Darien mattered because it connected generations of St. Petersburg residents to a shared local experience and destination. Its demolition shows how quickly that type of history can be lost when preservation comes too late. Even though the building is gone, though, it is still impacting its community, as its story raises an important question for public historians and communities alike. By what criteria do we determine which local places are worth saving before they disappear? Thank you so much for watching.